The fate of the largest empire on earth came down to a gap no wider than a few hundred feet. In the autumn of 331 BC, fewer than 50,000 Macedonian soldiers stood before an army that seemed to stretch to the horizon. King Darius III of Persia had gathered the greatest military force his empire could assemble. War elephants, scythed chariots, cavalry from every corner of Asia, and tens of thousands of infantry waited on a carefully prepared battlefield near the village of Gaugamela. To almost everyone watching, the outcome appeared inevitable. Alexander of Macedon was hopelessly outnumbered. Yet by sunset, the Persian Empire would be broken forever. Alexander had spent years chasing Darius across Asia after crossing the Hellespont, with an army far smaller than Persia's. Victories at the Granicus River and Issus had shattered Persian confidence, but had not destroyed the empire itself. Darius escaped both battles, preserving his authority and using the vast wealth of Persia to rebuild an even larger army. He knew the next confrontation had to be decisive. This time he would choose the battlefield himself. The plain near Gaugamela was almost perfectly flat. Persian engineers removed rocks, leveled uneven ground, and widened the field so Darius's feared scythed chariots could charge without obstruction. Each chariot carried blades extending from its wheels, designed to slice through tightly packed infantry formations. The king also deployed cavalry in enormous numbers on both flanks, hoping to surround Alexander completely before the Macedonians could exploit their superior discipline. Ancient historians disagree on the exact size of the Persian army. Some ancient writers claimed hundreds of thousands of soldiers stood with Darius, while modern historians estimate a considerably smaller but still overwhelming force. Whatever the precise number, Alexander faced an opponent with a massive advantage in manpower, cavalry, and resources. Against them stood roughly 47,000 Macedonians and allied Greeks. Veterans hardened by years of relentless campaigning, Alexander understood that he could not win by matching Persia soldier for soldier. His army had been built on discipline, training, and flexibility rather than numbers. At its heart stood the Macedonian phalanx, thousands of infantry carrying the long sarissa pike. Their formation resembled a moving fortress of spear points, difficult to penetrate from the front. Supporting them were agile light infantry, skilled archers, and the elite Companion Cavalry men who had followed Alexander through every major battle of his campaign. Unlike many kings, Alexander did not command from a distant throne or protected hill. He fought at the front, easily recognized by his polished armor, white-plumed helmet, and fearless habit of leading the decisive charge himself. His presence transformed morale. Every soldier knew their king accepted the same dangers they did. Across the battlefield, Darius watched from an elevated royal chariot surrounded by his elite bodyguards. He possessed every advantage a ruler could desire: greater numbers, favorable terrain, and an army drawn from one of history's richest empires. Yet commanding such a diverse force brought enormous challenges. Soldiers from dozens of nations spoke different languages, followed different traditions, and had varying levels of training. Coordinating them into one unified fighting force would prove far more difficult than assembling them. Before dawn, Alexander rode along his lines instead of launching an immediate attack. His generals urged a surprise assault under cover of darkness, arguing it might reduce the Persian numerical advantage. Alexander refused. He wanted victory achieved openly, not through confusion in the night. More importantly, he trusted his army's discipline in daylight. His confidence spread through the ranks. As sunrise illuminated the plain, Alexander made a move that puzzled both armies. Rather than marching directly toward Darius, he angled his entire force slowly to the right. The maneuver appeared almost reckless. Some Persian commanders believed the Macedonians were attempting to flee the prepared battlefield. Others recognized the danger immediately. If Alexander continued moving sideways, he could draw Persian cavalry away from the strongest part of their line and create the very opening he needed. Darius had anticipated a straightforward assault against his center. Instead, he faced an opponent reshaping the battlefield itself. Reluctantly, Persian cavalry began extending their own line to mirror Alexander's movement. What looked like a simple march was actually a deadly contest of positioning. Every step threatened to stretch Persia's formation farther apart. The trap was beginning to form, But neither army had yet committed to the full violence of battle. The Persian commanders could no longer wait. As Alexander's army drifted farther to the right, Darius feared the Macedonians might move beyond the carefully prepared ground where his chariots could operate effectively. He gave the order to advance. Across the plain, thousands of horsemen surged forward. Dust exploded beneath pounding hooves as cavalry from Bactria, Scythia, Armenia, and Media raced toward Alexander's moving flank. Behind them, the scythed chariots rolled into formation. Their iron blades flashed in the morning sun, each vehicle designed to rip open the dense Macedonian phalanx and leave chaos behind. For many armies, the sight alone would have shattered discipline. Alexander had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Instead of ordering his infantry to stand shoulder to shoulder in a rigid wall, he instructed them to create controlled gaps whenever the chariots approached. Trumpets echoed across the line as officers repeated the commands. Every soldier knew where to move. Every unit understood its role. The first wave of chariots accelerated. The horses thundered across the plain, their drivers urging them faster as spinning blades skimmed just above the earth. Persian commanders expected panic. Instead, they watched something almost unbelievable. At the last possible moment, the Macedonian ranks calmly opened. The charging chariots rushed into empty corridors instead of solid shields. Javelin throwers waiting behind the line unleashed volleys at point-blank range. Spears struck horses. Drivers were pulled from their platforms. Some terrified animals veered wildly through their own formations, while others crashed harmlessly between the disciplined infantry before being surrounded and destroyed. One of Persia's greatest weapons had been neutralized within minutes. But the real danger was still approaching. On Alexander's far right, Persian cavalry continued extending their line in an attempt to outflank him. The movement created exactly the situation Alexander had hoped for. As the Persians stretched wider and wider, tiny spaces began appearing between their units. Individually, those gaps meant little. Together, they slowly weakened the enormous front Darius had built. Alexander watched every movement from horseback. He was not looking at the soldiers directly in front of him. He was searching for one opening. Meanwhile, the center of the battlefield erupted into brutal combat. The Macedonian phalanx lowered thousands of sarissas as Persian infantry advanced. The collision echoed across the plain like crashing timber. Long pikes drove into advancing ranks, while Persian soldiers struggled to fight enemies they could barely reach. Dust, shouting, splintering shields, and flashing bronze consumed the battlefield. Even so, the Persian numbers began telling. Pressure mounted against the Macedonian center. Every fallen soldier created another gap to fill. Officers shouted constantly to maintain formation as wave after wave pressed forward. On the Macedonian left, the situation became even more dangerous. General Parmenion commanded the weaker wing of Alexander's army, facing some of Persia's finest cavalry. Unlike Alexander, whose attention focused on creating opportunity, Parmenion's task was simply survival. The Persian horsemen attacked repeatedly, forcing the Macedonian left backward. Clouds of arrows darkened the air while cavalry attempted to break through and encircle the flank. Fighting became desperate. Messengers rode toward Alexander requesting immediate reinforcements. For a brief moment, the entire battle hung in the balance. If Alexander turned back to rescue Parmenion too early, his carefully designed maneuver would collapse. If he ignored the crisis too long, his left wing might be destroyed. Few commanders in history have faced a more difficult decision. Alexander kept riding forward. To many observers, it must have appeared reckless, even irresponsible. But Alexander understood something invisible amid the chaos. Every cavalry squadron chasing his movement was leaving another small gap somewhere in Darius's enormous line. Then it happened. As Persian cavalry continued shifting to contain the Macedonian advance, a clear opening appeared between the Persian center and its left wing. It was not a massive breach, it was only wide enough for a determined cavalry force to exploit before the enemy could react. Alexander had spent the entire morning creating that single moment. He immediately recognized it. Without hesitation, he gathered the elite Companion Cavalry into a tight wedge formation. These were not ordinary horsemen. They were veterans who had fought beside him from Greece to the heart of Asia. Every rider knew exactly what came next. Alexander lowered his lance. His officers repeated the signal. The companions tightened their formation. Across the battlefield, Darius watched the movement unfold. He realized, perhaps only seconds before it happened, that Alexander had never intended to fight the strongest part of the Persian army. He had spent the entire battle forcing Persia to open its own door. Now Alexander was about to ride straight through it. Alexander drove his heels into his horse, and the Companion Cavalry exploded forward. Instead of charging across the entire Persian front, they struck like the point of a spear. Their wedge formation cut directly toward the narrow gap that had appeared between the Persian center and left wing. Every rider stayed tightly packed, shields overlapping, lances leveled. Dust billowed behind them as hundreds of elite cavalry accelerated across the battlefield. The Persians reacted instantly. Nearby cavalry commanders wheeled their horsemen around, desperate to close the breach before Alexander could exploit it. But they were already too late. The opening had existed for only moments, yet Alexander had committed without hesitation. His ability to recognize opportunity faster than his opponent had become one of his greatest weapons. The impact was devastating. The Companion Cavalry smashed through the first Persian line with incredible force. Long Xyston lances struck shields and armor, throwing riders from their horses. The wedge continued driving deeper, refusing to slow. Fallen men and frightened horses created confusion behind the breakthrough, making it even harder for Persian reinforcements to organize. Alexander was no longer trying to defeat the Persian army. He was hunting one man. Straight ahead stood the royal position of Darius III. The Persian king watched the Macedonian cavalry racing toward him at terrifying speed. Around his chariot stood the finest guards in the empire, including noble cavalry and elite infantry sworn to protect their ruler. They rushed forward to block the advancing Macedonians. What followed became one of the fiercest clashes of the entire battle. Companion cavalry collided with the royal guard in a violent struggle fought at close range. Spears splintered, swords flashed, horses crashed into one another as both sides fought desperately for only a few hundred yards of ground. Alexander himself remained at the front of the assault. Ancient accounts describe him fighting with extraordinary aggression, constantly pushing his men forward before the Persians could stabilize their line. Every second mattered. If the breach closed, the opportunity would disappear forever. Behind the king, panic began spreading. Messengers galloped between Persian units carrying conflicting orders. Dust clouds made it nearly impossible for commanders to judge the battle's true situation. Some believed Alexander had already broken through completely. Others feared the royal chariot was about to be captured. Then the impossible happened. The Macedonian cavalry came within striking distance of Darius himself. The Persian king suddenly faced the same terrifying choice he had confronted years earlier at Issus: stand and risk capture, or flee and preserve his life. For a brief instant, the fate of the largest empire in the world rested on that single decision. Darius turned his chariot. Seeing the king withdraw shattered the confidence of those closest to him. The royal guard began falling back to protect the retreat. Units farther away misunderstood what they were witnessing. Rumors spread almost instantly that the king had abandoned the battlefield. An army held together by loyalty to one ruler began coming apart. What started as an orderly withdrawal quickly became confusion. Confusion became fear. Fear became collapse. Across the Persian center, soldiers started pulling away from the fighting. Cavalry formations lost cohesion as commanders struggled to determine whether they should continue attacking or protect the retreating king. Entire units drifted backward without receiving formal orders. Alexander recognized the psychological collapse immediately. He urged his cavalry even harder, hoping to capture Darius before he could escape. Had he succeeded, the war might have ended on that very afternoon. But at the height of his pursuit, another messenger reached him with urgent news. Parmenion's left wing was close to breaking. While Alexander's charge had shattered the Persian center, thousands of Persian cavalry on the opposite side of the battlefield continued pressing hard against the Macedonian left. Some had even broken through and threatened the baggage camp behind Alexander's army. If the pressure continued, part of the Macedonian force could be isolated and destroyed. Alexander faced another impossible decision: continue chasing Darius and risk losing half his army, or abandon the pursuit to save his men. Reluctantly, he chose the army. Turning away from the fleeing Persian king, Alexander redirected the Companion Cavalry toward the struggling left wing. The maneuver cost him the chance to capture Darius, but it preserved the discipline and unity that had made victory possible in the first place. As Alexander raced back across the battlefield, he encountered retreating Persian cavalry moving in the opposite direction. What followed was one of the most chaotic episodes of Gaugamela. Horsemen collided head-on in clouds of dust, fighting at full speed with almost no room to maneuver. Confused soldiers from both armies became mixed together as the battlefield dissolved into scattered pockets of desperate combat. Eventually, Alexander's arrival stabilized the Macedonian left. The remaining Persian attacks lost momentum, and one by one, their formations began to withdraw. By late afternoon, the enormous army Darius had assembled no longer existed as a single fighting force. It had become a fleeing empire,